My first drink was when I was 4 years old, and my parents were at a party, and my father kept giving me little sips of beer until I got drunk and passed out.
Childhood trauma and addiction. If you feel alone in facing those demons, this show's for you. Let's talk about it with Barry Smith on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Hey, we're so glad you're here. You always have a place at our table. We just don't let you talk. But you're welcome. In case you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter, our executive producer, is here. Matthew, your wife got you a fitness watch that tells you if you're healthy or not. How's that working?
It works. I couldn't get it around my wrist, so I guess it's working.
And our producer, Jeremy, is in the little glass booth, and soon he will be attending the Grammy Awards. That's next week, isn't it?
It's coming right up, isn't it? Yeah.
Listen, do tell Jelly Roll I said hello.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an old friend of mine.
Our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in the tech bunker. The last time my computer crashed, John asked if my work was saved. And do I have to read this?
I'm proud of this one.
The last time my computer crashed, John asked if my work was saved, and I said, that's up to God. That's so bad. Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. George is happy to have some burning questions for Barry, just so he can warm up. And Kathy Wyatt is serving Jesus and not with us today. Our guest is very unusual. And we've known each other for years, and he is a benediction, not only on my life, but a lot of other lives. His name is Barry Smith. Now, that's about as pedestrian as Steve Brown is. There's got to be 8 billion Barry Smiths around. He's a former pastor until he screwed it up. He's an author. He's a teacher. He's a prison mentor and ministry leader. And his new book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is Grace in the Morning, a former pastor's memoir of overcoming childhood trauma and addiction. Well, I guess, Barry, the place to start is at the beginning. Let's go back to some of the roots that you have in your family, which were dysfunctional on steroids, I think. Talk about that, and then we'll talk about what happened.
So I grew up in a family with alcohol being very prevalent. My mother was an alcoholic. She died from her alcoholism. My father's father had died when he was 10, so he didn't have much of an upbringing himself. And my parents came together early 50s, and they tried to do the best they could, I believe. But the best they could was still pretty harmful to me as I was growing up.
Do you, you would, and I know booze played a part, and we're going to get to that in this story. But I would think with parents and those kinds of things, the alcoholism in the family, you would run as fast as you can in the other way from beer. But you didn't.
Well, when I was young, it wasn't that I ran away from it. I just wasn't interested in it.
Yeah.
I had seen all the chaos that it had brought into my family, and I just wasn't interested in partaking in it. And I did not for many years. Yeah, it was when I was in high school that I met Jesus through a Young Life club at my high school, and my friends became the friends from Young Life and friends from church. And they might have been, but as far as I knew, nobody was drinking, and it just wasn't something that we did. And alcohol didn't really become a problem for me until much later in life, my 40s, 50s, before it really grabbed hold of me and I became an alcoholic.
In other words, the pastorate drove you to it, right? I get that. I've often thought I could do this better drunk.
Yeah, I won't say the pastorate drove me to it. I will say a lot of the hurt and shame that I carried in my heart did, but the pastor didn't help. Didn't help that.
Tell us a little bit about what happened. It's detailed in the book, and it'll make you wince. But talk about that some and connect it with your wife too, Gail.
I will. So the message that I got growing up was that I was dumb, that I was ugly, and that nobody would ever want to have anything to do with me. And I carried those things in my heart. And one of the stories I quote in the book was from Anne Lamott, who talked about when she was a child, somebody had said something very ugly about her. And her father kind of joked along with the person who had said the ugly thing, and that she not only heard it, but she took it in, and it took root into her heart. And that was what some of the ugly things that I heard growing up did to me. They took root in my heart. And so there were a number of ways, even after becoming a believer, that I sought, other than from the Lord, to kind of make myself feel better. Some of that was in a relationship with my first wife. Some of that was just making myself feel better through outside means. Food was a big thing for me. Food would make me feel better until it didn't. But a big part of that was ministry success. When people told me that I was good at what I was doing in ministry, that kind of made me feel like I had some value. But eventually I reached a point where none of that worked. And those voices of you're ugly and you're dumb and nobody wants you became more than I could handle. And I began finding some relief in a drink, because with a drink, I didn't hear those voices as loud, and I didn't feel the depth and the despair. So as you have said, I screwed up my life, ended up divorced, homeless, living in a homeless shelter. And then Gail was somebody that I had met years before. We had worked together before, and we reconnected. And through that reconnection, we eventually got married. And what I found in Gail was somebody that really got grace, and that grace tells us that a person shouldn't be defined by the worst thing he's ever done. And that was grace. That was Gail's view. And Gail had known me before I had fallen apart, and before I'd become an alcoholic, and before I'd become angry and abusive and living in a homeless shelter. And she knew that the real me was the person that she knew before those things took over in my life. So Gail and I did reconnect, and we got married. And then through the unconditional love and acceptance that I experienced from her is where I began to be able to really believe that I had that unconditional love and acceptance from God.
Were you in the homeless shelter when you reconnected, or were you out by then?
No, I was in the homeless shelter. We were both on Facebook, and we found each other on Facebook while I was living in the homeless shelter. And we started talking through Facebook and then through email. And then she was in Miami. I was in Baltimore. She came up to visit me. And then I moved back to Miami to see where things were going to develop with her.
Well, do you have a passion? If you get in prison and you're working there, which is where you do ministry.
Yeah.
I have a friend that who has a prison ministry, and one time in a large crowd, he asked how many of you had a parent who said you're going to end up in jail, and he said almost every hand in the house went up.
Yeah.
Do you have a passion for people because you've been there and you've done that and you know what they're feeling?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you now, do you do seminary in prison? That's crazy. That seems
we
like
do.
it sounds like a double punishment to prisoners. I don't understand. Are you training prisoners to be leaders in the church?
We are. We work with Miami International Seminary. They have a seminary in prison program, and I oversee 2 of those in prisons in Georgia at the moment. And yes, we are training men to become pastors, elders, teachers, leaders in the church. They're serving while they are still incarcerated. And then some of those guys who have been released from prison have gone on and become ordained pastors and are serving in the church.
Man, that's got to be a ministry that makes you almost speak in tongues and dance. And I know your Presbyterian background, and that doesn't.
Yeah,
dancing.
No.
Do you,
I've been learning prison speak, so maybe the tongues part, but no dancing.
Listen, we've got a bunch more stories to hear from Barry as we follow this through. It's a good book. Keep you awake at night, and you'll say, I don't believe I would have said that. But he says it anyway, and he does it for your benefit, for the benefit of the kingdom. Sometimes authenticity, even about the dark stuff and the hard stuff and the failures and the sin, is a gift that we give to the world. And we say clearly, if Jesus can love me, he can love any of you. The book is Grace in the Morning, a former pastor's memoir of overcoming childhood trauma and addiction. Hey, listen, don't go anywhere. Like Jesus, we're coming back. Hey, thanks for joining us. We're talking with author Barry Smith. His book is called Grace in the Morning, a former pastor's memoir of overcoming childhood trauma and addiction. If you're into books that say really nice, rosy things, and you can sing Kumbaya as you read it, you're not going to like this book because it's very honest, it's very in your face, and it's filled with mercy and grace and hope.
Barry, I liked what you had mentioned that you've got the seminary in the prison. I have a friend who's a former drug lord, technically, and he was saved while he was in prison, and he was applying to Wheaton, and they're like asking for recommendations. He's like, my cellmate, is that cool? Can he do a letter of recommendation? So tell us a little bit more about that ministry, and take us maybe to the beginning of your involvement with teaching there.
So Miami International Seminary is primarily a missions organization. They train people for the ministry in third world countries all around the world. But in 2000, an inmate in a Florida prison wrote and said, I'd like to study theology. Can you help me? And so they recruited some pastors who went into this prison near Tampa and started a Bible college, basically, undergraduate level studies in theological studies. Went on to do master's programs there. Some of those men transferred to a prison near Miami, and they were doing the same thing in this prison in Miami. And this was about a year after I got sober, after the Lord gave me sobriety, which is a story I'd love to share later. I was really feeling like I wanted to do ministry again, but I didn't think I'd be able to get a job in a church after all of that I had done in my addictions. And that's when I met some guys from the seminary, and they were looking for teachers in this seminary and prison program and said they'd be glad to have me. So I started teaching my first class in this prison, and I don't know what to expect. It's a prison near Miami. I've got 12 students, most of whom are serving long-term sentences for very serious crimes. I'm teaching the book of Romans. And I'm in Romans 5 and 6, that section that talks about sin entering the world through one man, Adam, and salvation, righteousness coming through one man, Christ. And I shared with the guys that because they are believers, they are now united with Jesus. And because they are united with Jesus, because they have his righteousness, that everything that is true about Jesus is true about them. And so then I took them to the passage that talks about Jesus' baptism and how when he comes out of the water, the voice of the Father is heard saying, "This is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased." And I told these men that because you are believers and because you are united with Christ, God the Father says to you today, "You are my beloved Son, and I'm well pleased with you." Well, I looked up, and several of these hardened criminals have got tears in their eyes. And then afterwards, this fellow named Juan came up to talk to me. This is only my third time in a prison. I don't really know what it's like. Juan gets like right up in my face. No personal space with Juan. And if you were going to cast somebody in a prison movie, looking for the gang leader, Juan would be the guy that you would choose. I mean, he's got muscles rippling on top of muscles, bald head, tattoos all over, tattoos of snakes with blood dripping off their fangs and daggers with blood dripping. And he had 3 teardrop tattoos on his cheek, which I didn't know at the time, but I found out later that indicates that he's murdered 3 people. Is what that was for. And so Juan is staring hard in my face, and he goes, "Did you tell me the truth?" I go, "About what?" "Is God pleased with me?" I said, "Juan, are you a believer?" He said, "Well, I am now. I became a believer here since I've been in prison." I said, "Then God the Father says to you, 'You are my beloved Son, and I am well pleased with you.'" And he stared hard for a few more seconds, and he said, "That's the first time in my life anybody has ever said they were pleased with me."
Oh, man.
And I mean, that's broke my heart. And that's when I knew that this is what God was calling me to do, was to go behind the fences and razor wire and tell men and women that there is a God who loves them and is pleased with them, regardless of anything that they have done. Because they are in Christ, they are beloved of the Father, and he is pleased with them. I've been doing that now 8 years.
Do you find
coming up on 8 years?
Do you find, you're one jump ahead of preaching in a church? Before you can talk about forgiveness and redemption, you got to have people who know they need it. And in the church, we cover that up. I don't have any needs, but in prison, it's kind of hard to pretend that you're this wonderful person. So you get to start right at scratch and fly, right?
And our guys know that they're sinners.
Yeah, that's the first step, I guess.
Barry, I'm really impressed with your book, and something. It's a little bit of an aside, I guess, but one of the things that it reminded me of is just the power of story. And your book is a really compelling kind of a story. I mean, it almost reads like a novel in a sense, and I think people could really connect from that standpoint. Really well written. One of the things and we were talking about it at the break as well, is, and you see the example of it in prison and certainly in your own story, that the power that people's words have to affect and sort of identify, especially children, words spoken to children kind of even offhandedly or something like that. Talk a little bit about that and the impact it had on you and maybe the impact you see even with the inmates that you're dealing with.
Yeah. The impact it had on me, as I've said in my early years, I was told I was dumb. I was told I was ugly. I was told that nobody wanted me. And those really weren't things that I was told every day. But having been told them and having incorporated them and having them go into my heart, those were the things that I continued to hear over and over and over again throughout my life. And it really took not just good theology, because I had good theology, but it took the experience of a flesh and blood person who would hold on to my hands and look me in the eyes and tell me, that's not who you are. Who you are is in Christ. And it is because that you are in Christ that you are a new creation. And that is your identity, and that's who you are. But somebody who would hold on to me until I could begin to believe those things about myself. And I do find the same thing true about the men and women that we minister to in prison. They have been told their whole lives that they are worthless. They're told now by society that they are worthless, that we lock them up, we throw them away, we don't think about them. And one of the things that we try to do in both our prison ministry and our church ministry we have there is to rehumanize people so that they understand that they are image bearers of God, loved by Him.
Oh, man. Rehumanize. Man, that's a good calling. The great thing about you, Barry, is that now you're fixed and you don't have any of those problems anymore.
Yeah.
The great thing about Barry is that he'll tell you that he's not fixed permanently. And we all have to preach the gospel to ourselves and to each other. Because if we don't get dehumanized regularly, you can't make it. And that's what this program is about. So don't you dare go away. We're hanging out with author and prison minister Barry Smith. And you can find him at Facebook at BMS Book Lover. BMS Book Lover. And on Instagram at Barry Marshall Smith. And if you're on Substack, aren't you? Do you want to give us that information, Barry? Are you on?
Yeah, I'm on Substack. I don't know what the address is, but
that's
where
helpful.
I write.
We'll put it in the show notes. Don't you worry.
And just so you know, Barry is a part of the prison ministry of the denomination that a couple of us are a part of, the Presbyterian Church in America. And they have and continue to work hand in hand with MINTS, which is the International Seminary in Miami, really doing a great work.
Barry, so much of you, I was reading your story, and even early on, I'm like, here's a guy who's drawn too much to pie and booze. I'm like, okay, Barry's my people. Yeah, this is, I really like the story. So much of it had to do with identity and a bad narrative and believing a bad narrative. And I think of like the Garden of Eden. Satan wasn't selling an apple. He's selling a bad narrative that you can't really fully trust God. And if you buy into that bad narrative, the fruit sells itself. So could you tell us a little bit more about that, how that that bad image of yourself kind of set the stage for the eventual kind of downfall?
Well, yeah. So as I said, I had this image of myself, which not only that I was dumb and ugly and unwanted, but that I was the kind of boy that whose parents didn't love him, didn't like him. And so I transferred that really onto everybody else. And if I really felt like that my parents didn't love me or want me, then why would you love me or want me? And even more, why would God love me and want me? So although I became a believer and had good theology, went to good churches, went to seminary, learned good theology, and believed these things, deep down rooted in my heart was this shame of being the kind of person that had something so terribly wrong with him that other people would not like and want him. And so really exhausted myself trying to do things to make myself likable and lovable by others, but never quite getting there. And it was when I was completely exhausted by that's when I began to turn to alcohol for some relief. I'd say prior to that, though, I kind of reached the end of it all and was just totally in despair, and really spent a year planning my suicide. And I read a lot recently about ministers committing suicide. And I could have been one of those. I spent a year, every night I would lay in bed and try to think of ways that I could kill myself, but make it look like an accident. I have 4 children, and I really thought that if my children knew that their father checked out that way, it would be harmful to them, and I didn't want them to be hurt. So I would try to be creative and think of a way that I could kill myself, but have it look like an accident so that they wouldn't know that. And that was a year of doing that every night. And then in the morning, I would wake up and go, okay, I've got to get the kids up, get them to school. I've got to get to work. There are things waiting for me to do at the time. I was an executive pastor in a large church, and there were things waiting for me at the church that needed to be done. And I would go and do them. And by the afternoon, by the evening, the despair had settled on me again. And I would think of how I could just end all of this. And it was after a year of that when I started drinking in order to not feel those things and to kind of numb myself out. And it very quickly took over.
You know, the nature of life, and one of the most profound things that I've heard came from Albert Camus, who was not a Christian. He was a French existentialist, killed in an automobile accident, one of my heroes, but he was very he was fascinated with the Christian faith. But one of the statements for which Camus is noted is this: the only question a thinking person must deal with is the question of whether or not they should commit suicide. And so I think what you were going through, the trauma of it and what you were facing, is what people don't want to face or even think about or avoid. But without the realities that you're talking about and teaching in prison, everything else is meaningless. I mean, being an executive pastor doesn't mean anything. No. Being liked doesn't mean anything, or disliked. It's all meaningless except for Jesus. And that's what Camus had said. When you had your first drink, did you like it right off from the beginning or have to force yourself to get it down?
Well, my first drink was when I was 4 years old. And my parents were at a party, and my father kept giving me little sips of beer until I got drunk and passed out.
Good night.
Wow.
You maybe could win an award for the youngest alcoholic in the history.
I didn't really start drinking until I was an adult and was with some people from work who went to a bar and had a glass of scotch. And I thought it tasted like medicine.
All right. We're going to find. Now, wait. Better. We'll talk about it on the other side of the break. Spending your time here with us. By the way, if your New Year resolution was to get the best of Key Life Org sent right into your inbox, and of course, that is your New Year's resolution, boy, do we have some good news. Key Life Connection, our weekly email, does just that. So while you're thinking about it, go to keylife.org/subscribe and try it today. And it's free, so you can't complain. We're talking with Barry Smith, and his book is Grace in the Morning. We ran out of time in the last segment just before he was having his first drink of whiskey. And being a teetotaler, I'm interested. So, Barry, how did it taste?
Tasted like medicine. I didn't like it at all. But I sure did like the way it made me feel.
Oh, yeah. So it wasn't so much the taste, it was the feeling that followed it.
It was the feeling. All the anxiety, all the fear kind of drifted away, and I felt I was at peace. Mm-hmm. And that peace lasted for a few months until it turned into hell.
until it didn't.
Yeah.
Mm.
Again, coming from a long line of alcoholics, it very quickly took over my life as well. And I fell apart in very disastrous ways and hurt a lot of people.
Mm. Well, and I don't know if you want to say more about those instances or whatever, but we had also talked about, when you kind of really hit the wall and began to turn to sobriety and the steps to get you out of that. Talk about that.
Well, two things. I did everything that I was told to do. I was in the homeless shelter, which has a treatment program. I did treatment there. I did other treatment programs. I went to Alcoholics Anonymous. I went to Celebrate Recovery. But the things began to turn around when Jesus revealed himself to me. I knew that I'd screwed up my life, and I knew that whatever else was going to happen, I needed to reconnect with Jesus. And so I began reading through the Gospels. I got through the Gospel of Matthew. I got into Mark. I was in Mark chapter 1, and you get to verse 40, 42. And there's this scene where the leper comes and kneels before Jesus and says, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." And it says, Jesus, with compassion, moved towards him, touched him, and cleansed him. And I had this physical sense that Jesus was there and that Jesus was touching me, and that whatever else anybody else thought of me, I was okay with Jesus.
Mm.
That was the beginning of getting better, but that was not better yet. Continued to struggle. Left the rescue mission we've mentioned. I reconnected with Gail. Gail and I got married, and I would stay sober for 3 months, 6 months, and then I would have a relapse. One time went, I think it was 3 days short of a year, and had a relapse. The whole time I'm going to meetings, Celebrate Recovery, I'm going to Alcoholics Anonymous. I could get sober. I couldn't stay sober. There was something still broken in me, still hearing those voices that I was not enough. Until one day, Gail, my wife, went out of town for the weekend, and I spent that weekend drunk. She came home and found me passed out on the floor and said, when she got me up, put me to bed, we're going to need to talk. And I was pretty sure I knew what that meant. I'd heard from other people, we need to talk. And we need to talk meant we're done.
Yeah.
You need to go. I said, it's been 4 years of this. I can't do this anymore. And the next day when Gail got up and we talked, that was when she held my hands and she looked me in the eyes and she said, I am not going anyplace and you are not going anyplace. She said, I love you and I will not let go of you. But something has to change because this is killing you and it's killing us. And as I was talking earlier, that was really the first time in my life that I can remember experiencing from a flesh and blood person who was communicating to me the unconditional love and acceptance that I knew I had through Jesus, but had never experienced in my life. And that was the last day that I ever had a drink. The next day, I went to talk to my pastor. I was teaching a Sunday school class at our church. I missed the class because I was home drunk. I told the pastor I knew you're going to have to ask me to step down from teaching, so I just want to resign. And he looked surprised and said, why would I ask you to resign? Okay, you sinned that day. I sinned too. They said almost the same thing. He said, look, we love you. We're not going anyplace and you're not going anyplace.
Oh,
what he added is, he said, look, God has called you. God has gifted you. This church needs you. The church needs you, but we need you sober. And those two experiences, back to back, day after day, of experiencing from flesh and blood people, unconditional love and acceptance. That was over 10 years ago. I haven't had a drink since then. I haven't wanted to have a drink since then. Oh, by the way, you know that, Pastor Steve. That's Kent Keller.
I knew that.
Down at Kendall Presbyterian in Miami.
In fact, Kent's going to be on this program in a not too distant future, and I'll bring that story up about him.
Use his time to talk about me. That will be good.
Listen, by and large, has the church handled people like you and me well, or is you're an exception?
I think in most cases, churches are not really prepared to handle people like me well. And I really think the church I was in did the best they could, but they really weren't equipped to know what to do when they discover that they have a pastor who's also a drunk. And so I think they went into protective mode to protect themselves and protect the church. But in doing so, I ended up being excluded. And I understand that. I might have done the same thing in their position, but it did not help me. Right now, I'm thankfully I'm in a church that is more understanding and is more helpful to people like that, and I'm glad to be a part. Glad to be a part of that.
Do you think the church is moving more and more in that direction?
I think they are.
I do too. I
I
really
think they
hear
are.
that. I used to think there weren't very many people that were teaching grace that radical, as you have demonstrated in your book. But I get that from a lot of pastors and a lot of places. And so I think Aslan's on the move. And I think we're going to see God do some very important things in the not too distant future. Is this our last segment?
Mm-hmm.
Spit.
Better land it.
Doesn't seem like that
I
it
know.
was.
I
don't
know.
where this
Still
went.
some more submitted questions.
Barry, you did a good thing writing this book. I've said often that I used to grade students in their preaching by how often I said, I don't believe I'd have said that. And the more I said it, the higher their grade. You get an A+ on this book. And I hope
Well,
that
thank you.
And I hope that we're going to be able to talk again. Are you working on something now?
I am, yes.
You want to tell us what it is, or you just want to keep it a secret?
I want to keep it a secret for now.
Okay. Barry Smith, and the book is Grace in the Morning, a former pastor's memoir of overcoming childhood trauma and addiction. It's a book that'll keep you awake, and then once you're sufficiently awake, it'll put you to sleep, and you'll sleep soundly, because there's a God who will never let you go, no matter where you go, or what you do, or what you say, or what you drink. Grace in the Morning. We'll come back in a minute. Stay around. We appreciate you spending an hour with us. That means a lot to us. We're excited, by the way, to let you know about the 2025 edition of our print magazine. It's now available. You can claim your copy by going to keylife.org/free magazine. Well, Kathy's not here, and she's our queen of guest relations.
Mm-hmm.
Did you check to find out who's going to be here next week?
I did, and I certainly wasn't last minute panic that, yes, it was.
Well, he jumped up and ran out of the studio, and I said, was this something I said?
Oh, shoot, I forgot. Next week, we're going to have Jeffrey Barbeau. The book is called The Last Romantic, C.S. Lewis, English Literature and Modern Theology. We always talk about C.S. Lewis through the lens of theology and logic and all that kind of thing, but this guy is making the case that the movement of 19th century Romanticism has a big influence on Lewis, and his work is very indebted to that. So that's an angle on it I have never heard before. So
I had neither until this morning. I was reading the C.S. Lewis Bulletin of the New York C.S. Lewis Society. And the subject was Romanticism and its effect on C.S. Lewis, Wordsworth, and the poems that Lewis quoted. So it will be interesting next week, but boring. No, it won't, because all of these theological things, and Barry Smith is a good example of that. Theology isn't just a set of presuppositions, and you're a Christian if you nod in the right direction before those propositions. These are all about pointing you in the right direction so that you encounter the real God, so you encounter Jesus, who is not displeased with you. Wouldn't it be great to have somebody who knows everything about you, the way God knew everything about Barry Smith, and so did his wife, Gail, and yet love them anyway? That's kind of cool. I think I won't be a Buddhist for at least another 2 or 3 days. I'm going to hang around and hang out with Jesus, because sometimes he's the only one who will. Guys, we got to go. Been a good hour. Glad you're with us. But we're going to come back next week. Same time, same place. And it's our fond hope that you join us. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. That gives you a wide, wide berth.